As we all know, there's a huge gallery of PlayStation exclusives out there, but one I believe that has always gone under the radar is the inFAMOUS series. Sure, the first two games did have some initial success and recognition in the PlayStation 3 era, and it was thought that with a sequel or sort of reboot to those games with inFAMOUS Second Son on the new PlayStation, that it could possibly push the franchise to a new and unexplored audience. However, it seems that the game really went under the radar like the other games before it had, and I don't really see anyone talk about the game when discussing the greatest of PlayStation 4 exclusives, and I don't really think that's fair. With a game that has an enticing and unique story, an incredibly diverse and fun gameplay and open world system, this game truly did not get the recognition that it rightfully deserved. An example of a game that is criminally underrated. The game takes place in 2016, supposedly 7 years after the story of protagonist Cole in inFAMOUS 2. However, it isn't really related to the previous games, only in title and in the aspects of its gameplay. As for the story, there isn't a direct continuation of previous games, and that's why we've got an entirely new protagonist, Delson Rowe. The game makes use of some incredibly well animated comic cutscenes that really do fit the aesthetic that the game tries to establish. A lot of the time these cutscenes are used, it's either when Delson absorbs a new power or he delves into the mind of the person at hand. As well as this, it's been utilized a couple of times for exposition within the game, where it's quickly established that the US government has created a special task force known as the DUP to hunt down and capture the world's remaining conduits, which have now been dubbed with the name bioterrorists. I'm not going to get into a synopsis of the game's story because other retrospectives on the game have already done that and with much greater detail. What I want to discuss is the greatest aspects of the story in terms of the plot and characters, and as well as some areas of the game's story that have some obvious errors of which I think if fixed would have made the story's composition a lot greater. The main character Delson is pretty well developed from the start, and the story starts by portraying his experience with now randomly being able to absorb powers from conduits, of which he's very keen to do at the start, going out of his way to get a better hang of all of his powers. This can kind of branch on over to the karma system within the game, which seems to be an aspect of the inFAMOUS series that makes it quite unique. It's of course not entirely unique nowadays if one game has the option to allow the player's actions to affect the real world scenarios in the game, because other countless games do it. Red Dead Redemption does it, Undertale does it, and there's too many other games to count that also do it. But the way inFAMOUS does it is that literally every action affects the power system, cutscenes, and how the world reacts to you whenever you're roaming the street. Let's say you've helped out civilians and have been helping Grace within the city of Seattle. People won't be running away from you, at least not in the middle of the game, and it will become a lot less hostile from general civilians. In contrast to this, if you see a protest going on and start shooting and blasting the civilians, the world becomes hostile in response to you. The karma system is unique in drawing out the player's agency in every aspect of the game. The player controls how the game's going to turn out, and whether the main character Delson is ruined by his sudden advent of a man's power fantasy, or if he's going to utilize his newfound supernatural abilities for the safety of those around him. I personally take the good karma route, because generally the story seems better written within that component. The other main conduits like Fetch, Eugene, and Hank generally seem like better characters when you're playing the game as a good character. And generally, when you're making some awesome graffiti on a billboard with your brother Reggie besides you, Delson really does seem like a kind-hearted soul. But it's not like the game is going to limit you in your ability to go on a power fantasy of your own, murdering everything and anything. Entire cutscenes change, and the way that you interact with other characters within the game completely changes when you play with evil karma. The eyes of Delson when he's taken this evil path is truly terrifying, especially when you contrast it to the scared boy that had just gotten a bunch of powers he never thought he would have. It's a complete contrast to the Delson that saves everyone and truly cares for his friends, which are the other conduits. He's really a hero in that sense, where he wants to change the corrupted image of so-called bioterrorists, of which is ironically created by one. Augustine serves as the main villain in this game, and oh boy is she the most unlikable character ever. Her demeanor is just annoying as all hell, and she really is condescending upon all other conduits around her. With her authority, she hunts down Delson until the very end of the game. I think in the context of this game, making an unfavorable villain really brings out the tragic lives of many of the conduits, such as Fetch, whose brother was killed by her own hands. But there's of course various events throughout the game which makes Delson personally hate her. I think one of the best cutscenes in the game that is evidently caused by Augustine's actions is when Hank betrays Delson, of which ends up with the death of Reggie, which really does enrage Delson. And that's kind of another reason why the good karma path just feels right. Him finding within him that he's able to forgive Augustine for all that she's done brings his entire character arc full circle, unlike the evil one where he just murders more for the sake of doing it. Augustine of course has her own motivations, where she seemingly does want to protect the rest of the people like her, but the manner in which she does so makes her truly dreadful. Well, to sum this all off, the game's story is definitely a fun ride, and although I personally wouldn't say that it's remarkable in being a story-driven game, the story is still fantastic regardless, and for me personally, got me into all sorts of other story-driven games, and so I do really like this aspect of the game, especially after playing it over 6 times.
The gameplay in Infamous Second Son is generally thought to be the star feature of this game. Now that's not to undermine the story is fantastic, but the gameplay is just so good. Our main character, Delson, has the power to absorb the powers of other conduits, and this allows for a really fun and interesting gameplay style. I've had so much fun sprinting around Seattle with the neon power, flying through town with the video power, phasing through vents with the smoke power. Oh yeah, and then there's also the concrete power. But let's not say anything other than that it was introduced way too late. But the powers in this game are so damn fun, and allow for some of the most awesome traversal mechanics and such sick combat mechanics. And something that I thought was pretty interesting and was worth mentioning was how the karmic decisions you make as Delson affect not only the story, but also some of the powers you can use. If you decide to be destructive or make evil decisions, you can utilize powers that are more destructive and cause more death. Whereas if you utilize hero mechanics, you can get powers that would instantly subdue enemies rather than murdering them. Switching from different powers are also really fluid and smooth. I often found myself jumping from building to building with my neon power, only to absorb powers from an antenna and get the video powers. Flying around town, I'd then absorb powers from a chimney and get the smoke powers. And then there's this concrete power, which is objectively the worst power in the game. Fight me. For the most part, the boss fights in this game are pretty ordinary. Don't get me wrong, the video boss battle against Eugene was awesome, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, but that's kind of an outlier. The first boss fight, if you can even call it that, was more of a wild goose chase than an actual fight. I mean, the whole boss was literally just turning off the lights. The fight against Eugene in his video game-like world, on the other hand, was awesome. Jumping from platform to platform, hurling attacks at this giant beast, and dodging its attacks was so much fun. It felt like I was actually fighting a boss, and it was awesome. Now the first fight with Augustine was, in my opinion, just above average. People may disagree with me, but I just didn't find it very creative. I think it was cool utilizing the different powers to lay out a barrage of attacks onto this woman surrounded by rocks, but for me personally, it didn't feel as gratifying, considering the story leading up to that moment. As for the second Augustine fight, well, it wasn't good. It's the final mission. You get your final concrete power, and are introduced to the powers just because your friends chuck in the power sources. I don't think it was well done at all. I enjoyed the thrill of taking down DUP bases and then getting a new attack through that, whereas in this fight, the concrete power was just introduced. What would have been awesome was if it was acquired in the first fight. You play around with it for a bit and unlock the attacks through means like taking down DUP bases. But this was laid onto you way too quickly, and the power isn't even good. It's way too destructive. And the boss fight itself was just boring. I'm all for memorizing attack patterns in bosses. Hell, I beat Sans from Undertale by memorizing attack patterns, but this was just boring. It was the same 3 or 4 attacks just repeated. You run around and jump on a bird made out of concrete and do some other stuff that I just don't care to remember. But that's enough of the boss fights. One thing that was incredible was the open world of Seattle. I mean, running around the cityscape, jumping from building to building, gliding over this incredible area was all just so much fun. Not all open world games utilize good traversal mechanics, but this one was definitely a one that did. And the little side activities that you could undertake were so fun for me, and that's a rare case. I often found myself trying to complete every mission and side activity in every region of Seattle. I'd hunt down drones to upgrade my skills from the skill tree. I'd subdue a secret DUP agent and get rid of a hidden camera. But by far my favourite side activity in Infamous Second Son was the stencil art. This game so awesomely utilized the PlayStation 4's DualShock controllers to make this feel really damn realistic. That first time I did it at the start of the game, turning my controller to the side, shaking my controller as if it was a spray can, and actually hearing the rattle come from the controller was so cool and bizarre to me, and really drew me into the game and had me wanting more. And then completing those regions and shutting down the rule of the DUP in that specific district was so fun. Just defeating a bunch of enemies only to spray paint on their building was oddly satisfying. but nonetheless was super fun.
Well, that's it from today's video. I hope you all really did enjoy this type of video, and I hope you enjoyed having my friend into the video as well. As for what's next, I haven't really planned that out, but I think maybe a In Defense of Cyberpunk 2077 video might come out next week, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.